Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. From his earliest years, there were signs that his life would not follow a normal path. His family life was tense and unstable. His father was known to be strict and often physically abusive, while his mother struggled with her own mental health issues. The atmosphere at home was one of conflict, fear, and emotional neglect. For a child as sensitive and withdrawn as Richard, this environment planted the seeds of future instability. By the time he entered elementary school, Chase was already displaying behaviors that alarmed those around him. He was withdrawn, socially awkward, and often the target of bullying. Teachers noticed that he had difficulty focusing on lessons, and he seemed unable to connect with his classmates. As the years passed, three disturbing patterns began to emerge in his behavior. He wet the bed while past the age when children usually stop. He became fascinated with setting fires, and he displayed cruelty to animals. These three behaviors, later known as the McDonald Triad, were recognized by psychologists as early warning signs of potential future violence. As Richard entered adolescence, his difficulties only deepened. He struggled to form relationships with girls and felt increasing isolation. His attempts at socializing often ended in rejection, which fed into feelings of inadequacy. By his teenage years, his thoughts began to turn dark. He became obsessed with the idea that something was wrong with his body. He told friends that he believed his heart would sometimes stop beating. At other times, he was convinced his blood was drying up or that his organs were shifting inside his body. These delusions grew stronger as he moved into his 20s. Richard began experimenting with drugs, including marijuana and LSD, which intensified his paranoia. He also drank heavily. By this time, his obsession with his health had grown into full hypochondria. He visited doctors repeatedly, complaining of bizarre symptoms. At one point, he insisted that his blood was turning to powder. At another, he said bones were moving around under his skin. Doctors noted his complaints, but found no medical evidence to support them. When conventional medicine failed to give him answers, Chase turned to his own twisted solutions. He became convinced that the only way to survive was to replenish his body with blood. He began capturing animals, killing them, and drinking their blood. He dissected rabbits, dogs, and cats, blending their organs into drinks, and smeared blood on his face and body. His apartment became filled with carcasses and bones. To neighbors, he was an odd, dirty, disheveled man who lived in filth. But behind closed doors, his obsessions were intensifying into something dangerous. In 1975, Richard's behavior grew, so bizarre that he was placed in a psychiatric institution after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. There, his blood fixation continued. Staff caught him killing birds through the bars of his window and drinking their blood. The other patients began to call him Dracula. Doctors eventually released him into the care of his mother, but she made a critical mistake. Believing medication was dulling her son, she took him off his antipsychotic drugs. Without treatment, Richard Chase's delusions spiraled out of control. By the late 1970s, his descent into violence was complete. On December 29, 1977, he committed his first known murder. Driving through Sacramento, he fired his gun at a random man named Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer who was helping his wife carry groceries. The man collapsed in the driveway, shot and killed by a stranger he had never met. It was a senseless, motiveless killing, and the randomness of it terrified the community. Just weeks later, on January 23, 1978, Richard escalated dramatically. He entered the home of 22-year-old Teresa Wallen, who was 3 months pregnant. She had stepped outside to take out the trash. When she returned, Chase confronted her inside her own house. He shot her, killed her dog, and mutilated her body. His compulsion for blood drove him to cut her open, remove organs, and smear blood across the walls. The crime scene was so brutal that investigators struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The most horrific event came only 4 days later. On January 27, 1978, Chase broke into the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Miroff. Inside with her that morning were her 6-year-old son, Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and a friend named Dan Meredith, who had stopped by to visit. Chase shot Meredith first as he entered, then turned his gun on Evelyn and Jason. He assaulted and mutilated Evelyn's body, drank blood, and carried out acts of necrophilia. He abducted baby David, taking him from the house. The crime shocked investigators when they arrived at the scene. It was a massacre, unlike anything Sacramento police had seen before. A manhunt was launched immediately. Witnesses had seen a strange, gaunt man wandering the neighborhood in a blood-stained jacket. Police began tracing reports of such a figure and soon identified Richard Chase as a suspect. They placed him under surveillance, watching as he returned to the area of the murders. When they finally entered his apartment, they uncovered a nightmare. The walls and floor were smeared with blood. Blenders sat on counters filled with bloody organs. The refrigerator contained body parts. Police later discovered that the missing infant, David, had been killed and discarded. Richard Chase was arrested on January 28, 1978. In custody, he confessed in a detached manner, speaking of his need for blood to survive. He claimed he had no choice, that his organs were failing and he had to replenish them with blood. His trial in 1979 drew national attention. The defense argued that he was insane, pointing to his long history of schizophrenia, delusions, and psychiatric treatment. Prosecutors, however, emphasized the planning behind the murders, his ability to acquire weapons, and the sequence of escalating crimes. In the end, the jury convicted him of 6 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. Life on death row was bleak. Other prisoners feared him and largely avoided contact. He spent his days isolated, still consumed by paranoia and delusions. On December 26, 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell. He had hoarded antidepressant pills prescribed to him and overdosed. At the age of 30, his life ended as disturbingly as it had been lived. The legacy of Richard Chase is remembered as one of the most terrifying examples of untreated mental illness leading to catastrophic violence. He was not driven by money, revenge, or jealousy, but by delusions so deep that he believed blood was the only thing keeping him alive. His story remains a dark reminder of how fragile the line is between sickness and horror when intervention fails. Next story. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His childhood was troubled from the beginning. His parents' marriage was turbulent, marked by constant arguments and separations. Dean and his younger brother, Stanley, grew up in an environment where stability was scarce. When Dean was just 7 years old, his parents divorced. His mother remarried soon after, and the family relocated to Vidor, Texas, before finally settling in Houston in the 1950s. Dean was a shy and introverted child, described as quiet and polite by neighbors and classmates. He struggled to make close friends and preferred spending time alone. Despite this, teachers found him to be an attentive student who performed reasonably well in school. He rarely caused trouble and projected an image of a reserved young man. Yet beneath this calm exterior, unsettling traits began to form. When his mother and stepfather opened a small candy company called the Pecan Prince, Dean took on a prominent role. He worked long hours in the family business, eventually becoming vice president when his parents divorced again and his mother remarried for the 3rd time. By the early 1960s, Dean's mother established her own candy shop, the Corll Candy Company, and Dean became deeply involved. Children from the neighborhood frequently visited the shop, drawn by the free candy Dean would hand out. Over time, he earned the nickname the Candy Man. On the surface, he seemed like a hard-working, helpful young man devoted to his mother and the family business. But rumors began to circulate. Some parents noticed Dean showed too much interest in teenage boys who hung around the shop. He often offered them candy, small gifts, and even part-time jobs. It was during these years that Corll began cultivating relationships with vulnerable young boys, establishing trust while concealing darker intentions. In 1964, Dean was drafted into the U.S. Army and stationed in Fort Polk, Louisiana, before being transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia, and later Fort Hood, Texas. His service was unremarkable, but he complained of being unhappy and lonely. After serving less than 2 years, he requested a hardship discharge to return home and help with the candy business, which was granted. His time in the military seemed to do little to change him, but his return to Houston marked the beginning of his transformation into a predator. By the late 1960s, Dean Corll was in his late 20s, living in an apartment near Houston Heights. He began to befriend local teenagers, luring them in with alcohol, marijuana, and a place to hang out. It was during this time that he met 2 boys who would later become his accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Brooks was a shy teenager who looked up to Corll as a father figure, while Henley was a troubled boy from a poor family. Corll manipulated both, offering them money, gifts, and attention. Corll's crimes began in 1970. He developed a brutal pattern of abducting teenage boys, often runaways or young men who trusted him. Once lured to his home, they were restrained with handcuffs or ropes. Corll subjected his victims to prolonged torture, sexual assault, and eventually murder, often strangling them or shooting them. The bodies were disposed of in rented storage lockers, remote fields, or buried in rented boat sheds. His ability to carry out so many murders without detection was partly due to his manipulation of Brooks and Henley. Both teenagers assisted him, helping lure victims with promises of parties, drugs, or money. Corll paid them for each boy they brought to him, turning them into willing participants in his crimes. The arrangement lasted for years, allowing Corll to continue killing without arousing suspicion. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean Corll is believed to have murdered at least 28 boys, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history at that time. The victims ranged in age from 13 to 20, many of them disappearing from the same Houston neighborhood. Families were devastated, reporting their children missing, but authorities at the time often dismissed the cases as runaways, failing to see the growing pattern. By 1973, however, cracks in Corll's control began to appear. Elmer Wayne Henley, who had been working for Corll since he was 15, started to feel uneasy. He had introduced several victims to Corll, but the weight of his actions and the horror of the crimes began to trouble him. Still, Corll continued his violent spree, convinced he was untouchable. The end came suddenly on August 8, 1973. That day, Henley brought a friend named Timothy Curley to Corll's house, along with 2 teenage girls. Corll became enraged at Henley for bringing females into the situation, something he had strictly forbidden. After the group partied with alcohol and drugs, Corll turned on them. He pulled a gun, bound the teenagers, and declared his intention to kill them. Henley, tied up alongside the others, managed to convince Corll to release him, promising to participate in the torture. Once freed, Henley turned the gun on Corll. In a chaotic confrontation, Henley shot Corll multiple times, killing him instantly. The reign of the Candyman ended not through police investigation, but through the betrayal of his own accomplice. In the aftermath, Henley confessed everything to police, describing the murders in chilling detail and leading investigators to burial sites. David Brooks also admitted involvement. The full scale of the crimes horrified the nation. Investigators recovered bodies from boat sheds, beaches, and shallow graves, each one a reminder of how long Corll had been able to operate unnoticed. Dean Corll's story remains one of the darkest in American true crime history. His murders revealed how easily a predator could manipulate vulnerable young people, how failures in law enforcement allowed missing children to be dismissed as runaways, and how a community could be devastated by a hidden killer living among them. Though Corll himself was killed before he could face justice, his crimes left scars on Houston that linger to this day. Next story. Herbert William Mullen was born on April 18, 1947, in the farming community of Salinas, California. Salinas, at that time, was a quiet town known for its produce fields, the kind of place where people thought they could raise families safely, far away from the chaos of big cities. Herbert's father, a veteran of World War II, ran the household with discipline and order. He was the kind of man who believed in strict rules and strong morality, and he wanted the same for his son. His mother, more reserved, kept the house in order and played the traditional role expected of her in that era. From the outside, the Mullen household looked like a place of stability. Herbert grew up in a typical suburban environment during the 1950s, a time when America was booming economically and a nuclear family was idealized. Teachers and neighbors described Herbert as polite, athletic, and intelligent. In school, he blended easily with his peers, excelling in sports and social activities. He wasn't the kind of child that raised suspicion. In fact, in high school, he was voted most likely to succeed, a label that suggested his classmates saw him as destined for something meaningful. But inside Herbert's mind, things were shifting. When he was 18 years old, a close friend of his, a boy named Dean Richardson, was killed in a car accident. For most young men, the death of a friend is a tragedy, but one that eventually heals with time. For Herbert, the accident left a scar that never healed. He became fixated on the fragility of life and began questioning what it meant to live and die. Around the same time, the 1960s counterculture was spreading across California, and Herbert was introduced to marijuana and LSD. What began as experimentation soon became a way to try to escape his grief. But with his genetic vulnerability and his personality, drugs didn't provide escape. They magnified his paranoia. By his early 20s, Herbert was showing clear symptoms of mental illness. He became convinced that his body was changing in strange ways. He would tell people that he felt his skull shifting, that his brain was being altered by forces outside of his control. He began hearing voices. Some days, he thought his neighbors were sending him messages directly into his mind. Other days, he was convinced that strangers were reading his thoughts. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. He was hospitalized more than once, but his stays were short. He often refused treatment, and when he did take medication, he would stop as soon as he felt slightly better. Each time, his condition worsened. During this time, Herbert developed a disturbing belief. California, in the early 1970s, had been struck by several noticeable earthquakes. Mullen became obsessed with them, reading about seismic activity and disasters. Slowly, he convinced himself that earthquakes were directly tied to human behavior. His delusion grew until he believed that earthquakes were a punishment for the failure of mankind to perform sacrifices. He decided that he had been chosen to prevent these disasters by offering up human lives. In his mind, the voices were guiding him. They told him who to kill, when to kill, and why it had to be done. His first victim came in October of 1972. Lawrence White, a homeless man, was walking down a quiet road in Santa Cruz County. Herbert pulled over, pretending to need car trouble assistance. When Lawrence approached, Herbert struck him repeatedly with a baseball bat until he died. It was a brutal killing done without hesitation. For Herbert, it was not murder. It was sacrifice. The killings escalated quickly. Just days later, Herbert picked up a young college student, 24-year-old Mary Guilfoyle, who was running late for an appointment. She trusted him enough to get into his car, never realizing what danger she was stepping into. Herbert stabbed her to death, then methodically dismembered her body. He scattered her remains, believing that this act, too, would appease the earth. In November 1972, Herbert entered a Catholic church. Inside, he attacked and killed Father Henri Tomei, a priest who had been hearing confessions. The killing of a priest shocked the community, striking at the very heart of safety and faith. To Herbert, though, it was part of his duty. As 1973 began, Herbert's spree grew worse. On January 25th, he targeted a friend, Jim Johnera, who had once introduced him to drugs. Herbert shot Jim and his wife, Joan, inside their home. Nearby, he also killed a visitor, Kathy Francis. His paranoia told him that these deaths were necessary. Days later, he came across 4 teenage boys camping in a state park. They were relaxing, enjoying the outdoors, never imagining they were in danger. Herbert shot all 4 of them, later insisting that they had been communicating with him telepathically and had agreed to be sacrifices. His final murder came in broad daylight on February 13th, 1973. An elderly man named Fred Perez was gardening outside his home in Santa Cruz. Herbert drove by, stopped his car, and shot him without warning. Neighbors witnessed the act, and police were called immediately. Within hours, Herbert was pulled over and arrested. In custody, he did not try to hide his actions. He calmly told investigators that he had been commanded by higher powers to carry out the killings. He insisted that the sacrifices had prevented massive earthquakes that would have destroyed California. He described hearing voices and receiving telepathic messages, explaining his actions with chilling certainty. At his trial later that year, Herbert's defense team argued insanity. They pointed to his long history of schizophrenia, his hospitalizations, and his delusional beliefs. But the prosecution highlighted the fact that Herbert had tried to cover up some of his crimes, suggesting he knew what he had done was wrong. In the end, the jury convicted him of 10 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison. Behind bars, Herbert remained a deeply disturbed man. He often isolated himself, speaking of conspiracies and continuing to claim that his murders had saved millions of lives. Fellow inmates described him as unpredictable and difficult to be around. Despite his illness, he survived in prison for decades, outliving many other high-profile killers of his era. On August 18, 2022, Herbert Mullen died in prison at the age of 75. His life had stretched from the quiet streets of 1950s California to the chaos of a killing spree that terrified an entire region. His crimes remain remembered not only for their brutality, but for the bizarre and tragic delusions that fueled them. The story of Herbert Mullen stands as a reminder of how untreated mental illness, when combined with paranoia and delusional thinking, can spiral into unimaginable violence. His victims were chosen at random, each life stolen to satisfy a fantasy that only existed in his fractured mind. And in the end, the man once voted most likely to succeed became a figure of horror in California's history. Next story. Edmund Emil Kemper was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. His early life carried the seeds of the darkness that would one day consume him. His father, Edmund Sr., had served in World War II, later working in atomic weapons testing. His mother, Clarnell, was controlling and verbally abusive, often belittling both her husband and her son. Their marriage fell apart when Edmund was just 9 years old, and his father left the family. This abandonment only deepened the resentment between mother and son. From a young age, Edmund was different. He was unusually large for his age, towering over other children, with a deep voice and quiet manner. Teachers noticed he was intelligent, even above average, but also deeply troubled. He developed a fascination with death, spending long hours alone in the basement, where he would perform cruel experiments on animals. He buried cats alive and later dug them up, dissecting them to understand their insides. These early signs of cruelty to animals, a classic warning, went largely unnoticed by adults. By the time Edmund was 14, his relationship with his mother had deteriorated further. Clarnell was harsh, often locking him in the basement at night, claiming she feared he would harm his sisters. She told him he was destined to become a failure and unworthy of love. Edmund absorbed these words like poison. In later years, he would describe her as the root of his hatred toward women. In 1964, at the age of 15, Edmund acted on his growing rage. He took a rifle, shot his grandmother, Maud Kemper, in the kitchen of her rural home, then turned the gun on his grandfather when he returned for buying groceries. Afterward, he calmly called his mother and then the police. He later explained that he wanted to know what it felt like to kill, and that he didn't want his grandfather to have to see his wife dead. For this crime, Edmund was sent to the California Youth Authority, later transferred to Atascadero State Hospital, a facility for the criminally insane. There, he was evaluated by psychiatrists who noted his high intelligence. He scored an IQ of 145, putting him in the gifted range. Despite his violent crime, he learned to manipulate the staff, earning their trust by studying psychology and mimicking the behaviors they wanted to see. After 5 years, at the age of 21, Edmund was released against the recommendations of some doctors who feared he remained dangerous. He moved in with his mother once again. Clarnell was now living in Santa Cruz, working at the University of California. Their relationship resumed its toxic cycle of insults and rage. Edmund felt trapped, mocked, and increasingly filled with resentment. Yet outwardly, he appeared harmless. He found work with the highway department and began hanging out in local bars where police officers gathered. He befriended several officers, earning the nickname Big Ed. They saw him as an awkward but good-natured giant, never suspecting the darkness inside him. In 1972, Edmund's fantasies turned into a killing spree. His targets were young female hitchhikers, common on California roads during the early 70s. He outfitted his car with a unique feature. He disabled the passenger side door so that once a woman was inside, she could not escape. His first victims were two Fresno State students, Marion Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. He picked them up near Berkeley, drove them to a secluded area, and killed them. He then dismembered their bodies, scattering parts across remote areas. In September 1972, he picked up a 15-year-old girl named Aiko Koo. He strangled her and later engaged in necrophilia with her body. Each killing deepened his obsession with control, violence, and death. Kemper's pattern continued. In early 1973, he murdered Cindy Shaw, a college student, whose body he dismembered and discarded in the ocean. The waves later returned parts of her body to the shore, horrifying the community. Over the next months, he killed 4 more young women, Rosalind Thorpe, Alice Liu, and others, all students, all hitchhikers. He transported their bodies back to his apartment, where he decapitated them, performed sexual acts on the corpses, and then disposed of them. He spoke later with chilling calm about how he practiced conversations with their severed heads, as if they were still alive. Despite the mounting number of disappearances in Santa Cruz, police failed to suspect Edmund. He was friendly with officers, often joining them at bars to discuss the ongoing cases. They had no idea that the man sitting beside them was responsible. In April 1973, Edmund turned on the person he hated most, his mother. One night, after an argument, he bludgeoned her with a hammer while she slept, then slit her throat. He decapitated her body, used her head as a grotesque object for his fantasies, and finally disposed of her remains. Later, he killed her close friend, Sarah Hallett, inviting her over and then strangling her. With his ultimate act completed, Edmund felt empty. He drove to Colorado, wandering aimlessly, then stopped at a payphone and called police to confess. At first, officers thought he was joking, but when he provided details only the killer could know, they realized the truth. At trial, Edmund confessed in chilling detail to 8 murders. The court weighed his sanity carefully. While psychiatrists testified about his psychopathy and his deep psychological wounds, the jury ultimately found him guilty. He received 8 life sentences without the possibility of parole. In prison, Edmund became a notorious figure. His size, intelligence, and calm demeanor set him apart. He participated in interviews, speaking openly about his crimes with an eerie detachment. He described himself as a man driven by compulsions, haunted by the voice of his mother, whom he symbolically killed again and again through his victims. Decades later, he remains alive in prison, one of the most infamous killers in American history. His story is remembered not only for the brutality of his crimes, but for the disturbing combination of intelligence, manipulation, and deep-seated psychological trauma that fueled them. Next story. David Richard Berkowitz was born on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His life began under difficult circumstances. His biological mother, unable to care for him, gave him up for adoption shortly after his birth. A working-class couple, Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, adopted him and gave him their name. They raised him in a modest apartment in the Bronx, trying to provide stability and love. But from the very beginning, David was restless. As a child, neighbors described him as difficult and prone to violent temper tantrums. He often lashed out physically, fighting with other children. Teachers noticed his intelligence, but also his lack of focus. He developed a fascination with fire, setting small blazes in vacant lots and trash bins. Later, Investigators would learn that he had set hundreds of fires across New York as a teenager, carefully recording them in journals. At home, the Berkowitz family struggled. His adoptive mother, Pearl, died of cancer when David was just 14. Her death left him devastated. His father remarried and moved away, leaving David to feel abandoned and unwanted once again. From then on, he carried a deep resentment toward women, believing they rejected him, ignored him, or ridiculed him. As a young man, David drifted. He joined the army at 18, serving in South Korea. His time in the military gave him discipline, but did little to ease his inner turmoil. When he returned to New York, he was lonely and disconnected. He worked odd jobs, including at the post office, but lived in small apartments where he felt isolated. By the mid-1970s, David's mind had grown increasingly unstable. He claimed to hear voices, specifically from his neighbor's dog, which he believed was possessed by demons and commanding him to kill. In his twisted delusion, he thought he was chosen as a servant of dark forces. These voices fed his rage against women and society. His first attack came on July 29, 1976, in the Bronx. Two young women, Donna Loria and Jody Valenti, were sitting in a car talking outside Jody's home. Berkowitz approached and fired a .44 caliber revolver into the vehicle. Donna was killed instantly, and Jody was wounded. The attack shocked the neighborhood, but police had few leads. In the months that followed, Berkowitz struck again and again. His method was chillingly similar. He targeted young women, often with long brown hair, sitting in cars or walking at night. On October 23, 1976, he shot Carl Denaro and his girlfriend Rosemary Keenan, wounding them both. In November, he attacked two teenage girls in Queens, Donna DeMazy and Joan Lomino, paralyzing one of them. By early 1977, his pattern became clear. New York was gripped by fear. On January 30th, Christine Freund was killed while sitting with her fiancé in a car after a movie. On March 8th, college student Virginia Voskerikian was shot dead as she walked home from class. The press began linking the murders. Witnesses described a man with dark hair, often carrying a gun. The killer taunted police and media directly. He left letters near the crime scenes, written in a bizarre style filled with references to demons, Satan, and his desire to kill. In one letter addressed to New York Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin, he called himself the Son of Sam, a name that would become infamous. The letters mocked police efforts and warned of further bloodshed. On April 17, 1977, Berkowitz struck again in the Bronx, killing 20-year-old Valentina Suriani and her fiancé, Alexander Esau. Their deaths added to the growing panic. Women across the city cut or dyed their hair, fearing they fit his victim type. Couples avoided sitting in parked cars at night. New York, already struggling with crime and financial hardship, now lived under the shadow of a serial killer. The attacks continued. On June 26th, Sal Lupo and Judy Placido were shot in their car in Queens. They survived but were gravely wounded. Then, on July 31st, 1977, Berkowitz committed his final attack. Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violani were sitting in a car in Brooklyn when Berkowitz fired into the vehicle. Stacy died and Robert was blinded. This murder, committed in a more populated area, proved to be his undoing. A witness noticed a man loitering near the crime scene and saw him driving away in a yellow Ford Galaxy. Police traced the car to David Berkowitz, who lived in Yonkers. When officers searched his car, they found a rifle, maps of crime scenes, and a letter threatening more violence. On August 10, 1977, police surrounded Berkowitz's apartment building. They found him sitting calmly in his car. When they opened the door, he reportedly said, "I guess you got me." He was arrested without a struggle. In custody, Berkowitz confessed to the shootings. He explained that he had been commanded by voices, claiming the dog of his neighbor, Sam Carr, was possessed and relayed demonic orders. Investigators were stunned by his rambling confessions, torn between viewing him as insane or as a calculating killer using madness as an excuse. At his trial, psychiatrists evaluated him, but he was deemed competent to stand trial. To avoid the death penalty, He pleaded guilty to all the murders and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released. In prison, Berkowitz initially continued his strange claims of demonic influence. Later, in the 1980s, he declared he had found God, calling himself the Son of Hope instead of the Son of Sam. He began writing religious material and letters, though many saw it as another attempt at manipulation. Decades later, David Berkowitz remains imprisoned in New York. His crimes left 6 dead and 7 wounded, but the fear he spread extended far beyond the victims. For a year, the largest city in America was paralyzed, its streets emptied at night, its citizens afraid of the shadows. His case remains one of the most haunting examples of how paranoia, delusion, and violence can intersect to create terror. David Parker Ray, later known as the Toy Box Killer, carried out a series of crimes in New Mexico during the 1990s that still stand among the most disturbing in American criminal history. Unlike many other killers whose names became infamous, Ray was never conclusively linked to dozens of murders. Yet investigators believe he may have had more than 50 victims. His crimes revolved around a specially outfitted trailer he chillingly referred to as his toy box, a place of captivity and torture hidden in the desert outside the small town of Truth or Consequences. David Parker Ray was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico. His childhood was fractured, his parents' marriage was unstable, and he was largely raised by his strict grandfather. His father, an abusive man, drifted in and out of his life. When his father did visit, he sometimes gave young David magazines filled with graphic sexual content, images that would imprint themselves deeply on the boy's developing mind. At school, David was quiet and withdrawn, often bullied for his shyness. He never dated and spent much of his free time alone. By adolescence, his inner world had grown dark. He began to develop sadistic fantasies about binding, torturing, and controlling women. He wrote some of these fantasies down in diaries and sketched elaborate devices. These writings, discovered decades later, revealed that his violent sexual imagination had taken root early and never left him. As an adult, Ray joined the U.S. Army and trained as a mechanic. He became skilled with tools and machinery, abilities that would later serve him in constructing his trailer of torture. After his service, he worked various jobs, often as a mechanic and repairman. Outwardly, he appeared unremarkable, an ordinary man living in rural New Mexico. He married and divorced several times, relationships strained by his controlling behavior and secretive habits. By the 1990s, Ray was living in a sparsely populated area near Elephant Butte Lake, close to the small town of Truth or Consequences. There, he kept a property with a modest house, some sheds, and a large trailer. The trailer was no ordinary vehicle. Inside, Ray had spent years constructing what amounted to a private torture chamber. The walls were lined with soundproofing. The space contained a gynecological chair, restraints, surgical instruments, whips, clamps, and a collection of homemade devices. He referred to the place as his toy box. Mounted on the walls were diagrams and photographs. A video camera stood ready to record. In his collection were also audio tapes, carefully prepared, in which Ray described to his victims what was about to happen to them. One of these tapes, later recovered by investigators, opened with a calm, chilling voice introducing itself as if it were a set of instructions. On the tape, Ray explained to the women that they were now his slaves, that they would be tortured, and that resistance was useless. Ray did not act alone. Over the years, he involved accomplices, including his girlfriend Cindy Hendy, and sometimes even his own daughter, who was implicated in aspects of the crimes. Together, they lured women, often sex workers or hitchhikers, into the trailer. Victims were drugged, restrained, and subjected to prolonged assaults. One known victim was a woman named Cynthia Vigil. In March 1999, she was abducted by Ray and Hendy after accepting a ride. She was taken to the toy box, where she was chained and tortured. For 3 days, she was held captive. But when Hendy carelessly left the keys within reach, Cynthia managed to free herself. Naked and bleeding, with a metal collar still around her neck, she fled into the street, flagging down a passerby who took her to safety. Her escape led directly to Ray's arrest. Police raided his property and found the trailer. Inside, they discovered the chair, the restraints, and the equipment exactly as Cynthia had described. They also found the recorded tapes, including one that investigators believed had been played to multiple victims. The contents confirmed that Ray had been carrying out his crimes for years. Further searches uncovered diaries in which Ray had documented crimes dating back decades, including references to victims whose bodies were never found. Authorities combed the desert around his property, searching for graves, but the terrain was vast, and no remains were conclusively linked to him. Ray was charged with kidnapping and sexual torture. His trial drew national attention. Cynthia Vigil testified about her ordeal, describing how she had been chained, whipped, and threatened with death inside the trailer. Two other women also came forward, each with similar stories. The evidence, combined with the physical reality of the toy box, left little doubt as to his guilt. In 2001, Ray was convicted of kidnapping and torture. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison. Cindy Hendy received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. Despite the scale of the crimes, Ray never faced murder charges, as no bodies were definitively tied to him. Still, investigators remained convinced that he had killed many of his victims, their remains lost in the New Mexico desert. On May 28, 2002, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in prison, just 3 years after his arrest. His crimes left behind a legacy of horror. The toy box, dismantled after the investigation, became a symbol of hidden evil lurking behind the facade of an ordinary man. The case also fueled debate about how many women might have been murdered without leaving a trace, and how many families would never know what became of their missing loved ones. Next story, Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, was one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, operating in the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 1980s. His crimes revealed deep flaws in Soviet policing and shocked the world with their brutality. He was born in 1936 in a small Ukrainian village, during one of the darkest times in Soviet history. His early childhood was marked by famine, deprivation, and war. Food shortages were severe, and his family lived in poverty. Rumors in the village suggested that one of his older siblings had been kidnapped and cannibalized during the famine, a story that haunted him for the rest of his life. His father was later drafted into the Red Army during World War II and captured by the Germans, an event that brought shame to the family in a regime that considered captured soldiers traitors. As a child, Chikatilo was weak and often bullied. He suffered from bedwetting into adolescence, and he grew up socially isolated, painfully shy, and plagued by sexual dysfunction. He felt powerless and humiliated, both at home and among peers. By his teenage years, he discovered that he could only achieve arousal through violent fantasies, often involving domination and control. In the 1960s, Chikatilo tried to live a normal life. He married, had children, and worked as a teacher. Outwardly, he appeared quiet, reserved, even timid. But beneath that image, his violent urges grew stronger. While teaching, he was caught fondling students and was dismissed from one of his positions. He drifted into clerical jobs, eventually working in a factory. His crimes escalated in secret. In 1978, Chikatilo committed his first known murder. He lured a 9-year-old girl, Yelena Zakitnova, into a house he had purchased. There, he assaulted and killed her, disposing of her body in a river. Although he was questioned, another man was wrongly accused and executed for the crime, allowing Chikatilo to walk free. This miscarriage of justice would repeat in his career, as Soviet authorities, desperate to maintain order, sometimes arrested innocent men rather than admit a serial killer was at large. From then on, Chikatilo embarked on a spree of killings that lasted more than a decade. His victims were mostly women and children, lured with promises of food, money, or small gifts. He targeted runaways, the homeless, and the vulnerable, people less likely to be reported missing immediately. His method was sadistic. He would lead victims into wooded or isolated areas, then attack suddenly. He stabbed repeatedly, often dozens of times, and mutilated bodies in a frenzy. Many victims were disemboweled. Some had eyes gouged out, a detail that puzzled investigators until Chikatilo later confessed that he believed a Russian superstition that a victim's eyes retained the image of their killer. For years, Soviet authorities failed to catch him. The secrecy of the Soviet system made police reluctant to admit a serial killer existed, as such crimes were seen as a symptom of Western decadence, not socialism. The investigation dragged on, involving hundreds of officers, thousands of interviews, and countless dead ends. Innocent men were arrested, imprisoned, even executed while Chikatilo continued to kill. By the mid-1980s, the murders were so numerous that authorities could no longer deny the pattern. The press remained muzzled, but people whispered of the maniac of Rostov. Special units were formed. Profilers studied the crimes and concluded that the killer was an ordinary man with a respectable appearance, someone who could blend in unnoticed. In 1990, after more than 50 known murders, Chikatilo's luck began to run out. Police had begun placing plainclothes officers at train stations and bus depots, areas where the killer often lured victims. On one such patrol, an officer noticed Chikatilo emerging from the woods, disheveled and suspicious. He was detained, and forensic evidence eventually tied him to multiple crime scenes. When interrogated, Chikatilo at first denied everything. But confronted with mounting evidence, he broke down. In long, chilling confessions, he described his crimes in detail, often with little emotion. He admitted to more than 50 murders, recounting how he had lured victims, how he mutilated them, and how the killings gave him release from urges he could not control. His trial in 1992 was a spectacle. Behind bars, inside a steel cage in the courtroom, Chikatilo sat while prosecutors read the charges of 53 murders. The families of victims wept and shouted. Chikatilo sometimes shouted back, sometimes ranted incoherently. The proceedings were broadcast widely, and the Soviet public, now in the era of glasnost, was horrified. He was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. In 1994, he was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. The case of Andrei Chikatilo exposed the vulnerabilities of Soviet policing. The wrongful arrests and executions of innocent men underscored how secrecy and denial had allowed a predator to operate for years. Forensic and investigative methods improved in Russia as a result, but for the families of victims, the damage was irreparable. Chikatilo's crimes remain a grim reminder of how monstrous violence can hide beneath the surface of an ordinary life. Next story. Joachim George Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, in the German city of Hindenburg, which today lies in Poland. His childhood unfolded against the backdrop of World War II. His family was poor, with many mouths to feed, and food was scarce. His father was conscripted into the German army and later captured by Soviet forces, spending years as a prisoner of war. This left the household without stability or protection, and young Joachim grew up in an environment marked by deprivation. Kroll was a weak, frail child. He suffered academically, never advancing beyond the most basic levels of schooling. Teachers described him as slow. He left school without qualifications, and he struggled with speech and social development. Later in life, psychological testing would show that he had an extremely low IQ, with the mind of a young child despite his adult body. After the war, the Kroll family relocated to West Germany. Joachim worked as a farmhand in his teenage years, tending animals and carrying out simple manual tasks. He lived in isolation, and his relationships with others remained shallow. His social awkwardness kept him distant from girls, and his lack of confidence turned into deep frustration. By his 20s, he had developed violent sexual fantasies that replaced real connections. He was incapable of forming a normal romantic or sexual relationship, and instead imagined control, killing, and possession. In 1955, at the age of 22, Kroll committed his first known murder. He encountered a young girl named Irmgard Strel. Luring her away to a secluded spot, he strangled her to death. Afterward, he mutilated the body and cut away pieces of flesh to take home. Later, he confessed that he cooked and ate the flesh, claiming it allowed him to save money on food. The murder was shocking, but police at the time failed to link Kroll to the crime. With no suspects, the case went cold, and Kroll returned to his quiet life, unnoticed. This first killing set a pattern that would stretch on for more than 2 decades. Kroll's victims were typically women and children, people he found vulnerable and alone. He would approach them in isolated areas such as fields, forests, or riverbanks. His attacks involved strangulation, stabbing, or both. After killing, he often sexually assaulted the body, and in many cases he cut off parts of the flesh. These pieces he brought back to a small apartment to cook and eat later. In 1956, just a year after his first crime, he killed again. His victim was a 12-year-old girl named Manuela Note. She was reported missing after failing to return home. Searchers later found her body in the woods. Like before, the body had been mutilated. Panic spread in the community, but investigators made little progress. By 1959, he struck once more, this time murdering Clara Frida Tesmer. That same year, he killed another young woman, showing that his killings were not isolated impulses, but a recurring compulsion. Each time, police investigated thoroughly, but Kroll's unremarkable appearance shielded him. He was quiet, polite, and looked like an ordinary factory worker. During the 1960s, the murders continued. In 1962, he murdered Monica Taffel, a 12-year-old girl, stabbing her multiple times. This time, suspicion fell on another man, who was arrested and convicted, further allowing Kroll to remain free. In 1966, he killed Ursula Rolling, a young woman who had been walking home. Later that same year, he murdered a 5-year-old girl, and not long after, he killed another child. Each victim was subjected to the same brutality: strangulation, stabbing, mutilation. The cases remained unsolved. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Kroll's murders followed the same rhythm. He would lure a victim, kill, mutilate, and then disappear into his life of anonymity. His killings were spread across different towns and regions within the Ruhr area, making it difficult for investigators to connect the crimes. At times, innocent men were arrested, charged, and convicted, while the Real killer moved unnoticed through the city streets. Kroll lived in small, cramped apartments, working in low-wage factory jobs. He was seen as odd but not threatening. Neighbors described him as a man who kept to himself. He often carried small bags of groceries, and he never invited anyone into his home. He had no relationships, no wife, no close friends. In 1976, his final crime led to his capture. In July of that year, a 4-year-old girl named Marion Ketter went missing near his apartment building. Neighbors raised the alarm, and police began to search. At the same time, other residents of the building reported a problem with their plumbing. The pipes had become clogged. Repairmen investigated, and to their horror, they found human flesh blocking the drainage system. This discovery pointed investigators directly to Kroll. Police entered his apartment, and what they found was a scene of quiet horror. In his kitchen, pots were on the stove, filled with stew made of potatoes, carrots, and pieces of human flesh. In his refrigerator, police found more human remains. The missing girl had been cut apart and was in the process of being cooked. Kroll was arrested on the spot. When questioned, he confessed with little resistance. His manner was calm, almost childlike. He admitted to killing 13 people over more than 2 decades, though investigators suspected the true number may have been higher. He explained his method, how he lured victims, how he strangled them, how he cut away flesh, and how he cooked it. In his own words, he said the flesh helped him save money on groceries. His trial began years later, in 1982. Prosecutors presented the evidence: his confession, the remains, and the long trail of murders. His defense argued diminished responsibility due to his low intelligence. Indeed, he was mentally impaired, but psychiatric experts testified that he understood his actions were wrong. The court agreed. Joachim Kroll was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was sent to prison, where he lived out the rest of his life quietly. In 1991, at the age of 58, he died behind bars of natural causes. The case of Joachim Kroll left behind deep scars in West Germany. For decades, a man who appeared harmless and ordinary had carried out some of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. His actions revealed not only the darkness inside him, but also the failures of police investigations that allowed him to escape detection for so long. Albert DeSalvo, later known as the Boston Strangler, was responsible for one of the most terrifying crime waves in American history. His name became tied to the murder of 13 women in the Boston area during the early 1960s, crimes that sent shockwaves through the city and remain debated to this day. Albert Henry DeSalvo was born on September 3, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts. His upbringing was marked by poverty and violence. His father, Frank, was an alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children. Frank DeSalvo's brutality was extreme. He once broke every finger on his wife's hand, and on another occasion, he forced his children to watch him have sex with prostitutes. The home was one of chaos, neglect, and abuse. Albert grew up in this environment with little guidance. By his early teens, he had turned to petty crime. He was arrested several times for burglary and other minor offenses. Reform school and juvenile detention became familiar places for him. Despite his troubles, he managed to join the U.S. Army at age 17. He served in Germany, where he gained a reputation as a competent soldier, but also developed a habit of soliciting prostitutes and committing minor theft. After returning home, DeSalvo married and had children. Outwardly, he tried to live a stable life, working various jobs including maintenance and construction. Yet beneath the surface, he remained troubled. He developed a compulsion for sexual assaults that escalated from indecent exposure to home invasions. By the late 1950s, DeSalvo began what police would later call the Measuring Man incidents. He posed as a modeling scout, approaching women and convincing them to let him take their measurements under the guise of offering them opportunities in modeling. While this behavior was strange and invasive, it did not immediately lead to charges, and DeSalvo continued to refine his predatory behavior. Soon after, he escalated into what police called the Green Man crimes. He posed as a handyman or maintenance worker, tricking his way into women's apartments. Once inside, he assaulted them. These assaults went unconnected at the time, but they showed the same compulsions that would lead to murder. In June 1962, the first of the Boston Strangler murders occurred. A 55-year-old woman named Anna Sleezers was found dead in her Boston apartment. She had been strangled with the belt of her bathrobe, tied in a bow around her neck. The staging was strange and deliberate. Within weeks, more murders followed. Most of the victims were women living alone, ranging in age from their 50s to their 80s. They were strangled with items of clothing, often left tied in decorative knots. Some were sexually assaulted. Others were mutilated. The pattern was chilling, and panic swept through Boston. Women kept their doors locked, neighborhoods grew tense, and newspapers filled their front pages with warnings about the killers stalking the city. The murders continued in 1963 and 1964. In total, 13 women were killed. While most were older women, later victims included young women in their 20s, broadening the victim profile and further confusing investigators. Despite massive police efforts, the case remained unsolved. Thousands of interviews were conducted, tips poured in, and detectives searched tirelessly, but the killer always seemed one step ahead. DeSalvo was finally arrested in 1964, but not for the murders. He had been caught for a series of sexual assaults, part of the Green Man cases. While in custody, he confessed to his cellmate, George Nasser, that he was the Boston Strangler. Nasser informed attorney F. Lee Bailey, who brought DeSalvo's claims to the authorities. DeSalvo then gave detailed confessions to police, describing the murders in ways that seemed to match the crime scenes. He admitted to all 13 killings. However, there was no physical evidence linking him to the murders, and his confession was inconsistent at times. Some investigators doubted he was truly the Strangler, believing he may have exaggerated or invented his involvement for notoriety or a plea bargain. In court, DeSalvo was not tried for the Boston Strangler murders due to lack of evidence. Instead, he was convicted of numerous sexual assaults and sentenced to life in prison in 1967. While in prison, DeSalvo was stabbed to death in 1973 under mysterious circumstances. Officially, another inmate killed him during a dispute, but speculation has lingered that his death may have been arranged to silence him. For decades, debate continued over whether DeSalvo was truly the Boston Strangler. In 2013, modern DNA testing linked him to the 1964 murder of Mary Sullivan, one of the final victims. The evidence confirmed that DeSalvo was responsible for at least that killing, strengthening the case that he had been the Strangler all along. The story of Albert DeSalvo remains both terrifying and tragic. It revealed a man shaped by a brutal childhood, driven by compulsion, and able to terrorize an entire city. At the same time, it showed the limits of police investigations in an era before DNA, when confessions were often the strongest evidence available. Arthur Shawcross, later called the Genesee River Killer, became known in the late 1980s as one of New York's most notorious serial killers. His crimes exposed deep failures in the justice system, since he had already been convicted of murder years earlier, only to be released and kill again. Arthur John Shawcross was born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine, the first of 4 children. His family moved often during his childhood, eventually settling in Watertown, New York. His early years were troubled. He was described as a slow learner, prone to bullying, and known for violent temper tantrums. Teachers reported that he had difficulties with reading and writing, but also noted his tendency to lash out physically. Later in life, Shawcross claimed that he was sexually abused as a child, both by relatives and older neighborhood children. He also claimed his mother engaged in inappropriate behavior with him. Whether all of these claims were true or exaggerations is debated, but there is little doubt that his upbringing was unstable. By his teenage years, Shawcross had dropped out of school and drifted into petty crime. He was arrested several times for burglary and vandalism. At age 19, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He served in Vietnam during the height of the war, working in supply units. Shawcross later told wild stories about his time in combat, including claims of cannibalism and brutal killings. But investigators who reviewed his record found little to support these accounts. What is clear is that his time in the military hardened him, and he returned to the United States more violent than before. Back in New York, Shawcross married and divorced several times. He struggled to hold steady jobs and continued to commit small crimes. In 1972, his violence escalated into murder. That year, he lured a 10-year-old boy named Jack Owen Blake into the woods near Watertown. Shawcross sexually assaulted the boy, strangled him, and left the body hidden. Weeks later, he lured an 8-year-old girl named Karen and Hill to a secluded spot near a riverbank, where he assaulted and killed her as well. The murders shocked the community, and suspicion eventually fell on Shawcross. He confessed and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. While incarcerated, Shawcross underwent psychiatric evaluations. Doctors noted his lack of remorse and his disturbing fantasies, but despite warnings, he became eligible for parole after serving only 14 years. In 1987, he was released. After his release, Shawcross settled in Rochester, New York, with a new girlfriend. For a short time, he lived quietly, working menial jobs. But within a year, he returned to killing, this time targeting sex workers. Between 1988 and 1989, Shawcross murdered 11 women, most of them prostitutes he picked up on the streets of Rochester. He lured them into his car, drove them to secluded areas near the Genesee River, and attacked. His methods included strangulation and blunt force. After killing, he often left the bodies in wooded or marshy areas, sometimes partially concealed but often exposed. The murders caused alarm in Rochester, but at first, police struggled to connect them. Many of the victims were women who lived precarious lives, making their disappearances less immediately noticed. As bodies began to turn up, investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer. The FBI was brought in to assist, and profilers built a psychological portrait of the murderer. a middle-aged white male, familiar with the area, with a history of violence. Police began surveillance operations, focusing on areas where sex workers gathered. In January 1990, Shawcross was placed under observation after being seen with a known prostitute. Days later, surveillance units followed him as he drove to a remote location. They watched him stop by a riverbank where the body of one of his victims had recently been found. This suspicious behavior gave them the opening they needed. Shawcross was arrested soon afterward. In custody, Shawcross at first denied the killings. Confronted with evidence, he eventually confessed in detail to 11 murders. He spoke matter-of-factly, describing how he picked up women, where he drove them, how he strangled them, and how he left their bodies. He showed little emotion as he described the crimes. His trial in 1991 was widely covered by the media. The defense argued that Shawcross suffered from brain damage and post-traumatic stress disorder from Vietnam, suggesting diminished responsibility. Psychiatrists debated his mental state, but the jury found him guilty on 10 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 250 years in prison, ensuring he would never be released. Arthur Shawcross lived in prison until 2008, when he died of a heart attack at the age of 63. The case left behind lingering outrage. Families of his first child victims in the 1970s had warned authorities that Shawcross should never have been released, yet the system allowed him out after just 14 years. His return to violence, claiming 11 more lives, became a grim lesson in the consequences of early parole for dangerous offenders. Richard Ramirez, who would become known to the world as the Night Stalker, was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a Mexican-American working-class family. His father, Julian, had been a policeman in Mexico before moving to the United States to work on the railroad. Julian was a strict, authoritarian man, quick to anger, and often physically abusive to his children. Mercedes, Richard's mother, worked in a local boot factory and was exposed to toxic chemicals daily. Richard's early years were filled with tension and fear. He lived under the shadow of a father who demanded obedience and punished any perceived misstep. His siblings recalled him as quiet, withdrawn, and constantly anxious, seeking safety by hiding or avoiding confrontation. From a young age, Richard suffered serious head injuries. At age 2, a dresser fell on him, leaving him unconscious. At 5, he was struck by a swing, causing further trauma. He later experienced frequent blackouts and seizures. These injuries would later be studied by psychologists as factors contributing to his later violent behavior. Despite his fragility, Richard developed a fascination with death and violence. He would spend hours alone, exploring cemeteries or rooftops, imagining scenarios of control and dominance over others. During his early teens, Richard formed a close relationship with his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran. Miguel returned from combat, carrying not only physical and emotional scars, but also disturbing stories and photographs depicting women he claimed to have tortured and killed. To a 13-year-old Richard, Miguel became a role model, demonstrating that power and fear could be wielded through violence. One night, Richard witnessed Miguel shoot his wife during a domestic argument, killing her instantly. Rather than recoiling, Richard internalized the event, absorbing the association between death, control, and personal power. He visited Miguel repeatedly after the incident, learning survival skills and the use of weapons. By his mid-teens, Richard's criminal behavior escalated. He smoked marijuana, experimented with LSD, and later became addicted to cocaine. He began stealing from neighbors, breaking into cars, and committing petty theft. School became increasingly irrelevant, and he dropped out in the 9th grade. His home life offered no guidance, and his fascination with violence intensified. At 17, he left El Paso for California, seeking independence and opportunity, while simultaneously moving toward a life of increasingly serious crime. He lived in motels, drifting between Los Angeles and San Francisco, committing burglaries and thefts to fund his growing drug habit. In June 1984, Richard crossed the threshold from theft and petty crime to murder. He broke into the Los Angeles apartment of 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow and slit her throat nearly to decapitation. The brutality of the act shocked authorities and signaled the emergence of a dangerous new predator. Over the next year, Ramirez committed a series of home invasion murders. Unlike most serial killers, he did not limit himself to one profile of victim. He attacked elderly men and women, young couples, and occasionally children. His methods varied. He shot some victims, stabbed others, and strangled or beat many. He sexually assaulted women and stole valuables, funding his drug addiction while leaving behind a trail of terror and death. By March 1985, Ramirez had intensified his spree, attacking multiple victims in a single night. Maria Hernandez survived being shot in her garage, but her roommate Dale Okazaki was killed. Hours later, he pulled Salian Yu from her car and shot her. Soon after, he killed Vincent and Maxine Zazera in their home. Vincent was shot while sleeping. Maxine was bound and brutally mutilated, her eyes removed and placed in a jewelry box. These crimes reflected not only brutality, but a ritualistic element, satisfying Ramirez's desire for domination and control over life and death. During the summer of 1985, Ramirez continued his attacks, often entering homes through unlocked windows or doors. Survivors described him as foul-smelling, with decayed teeth, bloodshot eyes, and a cold, emotionless gaze. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker, and fear spread across Los Angeles and surrounding counties. People avoided going out at night, installed alarms and locks, and armed themselves for protection. Schools warned children, parents kept them indoors, and entire neighborhoods felt unsafe. Police struggled to track him, though evidence slowly accumulated. Shoe prints from obvious sneakers, fingerprints, and ballistic analyses linked multiple crime scenes. Yet Ramirez remained elusive, moving between Los Angeles and San Francisco, striking at random. His unpredictability made him extremely difficult to catch, and residents lived in constant fear. The breakthrough occurred in late August 1985. After attacking a couple in Mission Viejo, Ramirez fled when residents observed his car and license plate. Police recovered the stolen vehicle and discovered a fingerprint that matched Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with prior arrests for theft and drug charges. His photograph appeared in newspapers and on television, giving the Night Stalker a face for the first time. The following day, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles, unaware that he had been identified. Shoppers recognized him instantly. Panicked, he attempted to flee, trying to steal a car. Residents pursued him, shouting that he was the Night Stalker. He was eventually cornered, beaten by citizens, and arrested by police. After months of terror, the reign of Richard Ramirez had ended not with a dramatic law enforcement operation, but with the intervention of ordinary people determined to stop him. Next story. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, into a family marked by instability and frequent upheaval. His father, Franklin Speck, was a strict man with a volatile temper, often physically abusive to his children. His mother, Doris, struggled with mental health issues and moved the family frequently, leaving young Richard with a sense of impermanence and insecurity. From early childhood, he displayed troubling behavior. He had difficulty in school, was often truant, and showed a growing pattern of deceit and aggression. He learned to manipulate adults, evade authority, and act impulsively, traits that would define his later life. As a teenager, Richard began experimenting with petty theft and burglary. He dropped out of high school and moved from job to job, rarely staying in one place. He developed a heavy drinking habit, sometimes mixing it with drugs, and his life spiraled into a series of minor criminal activities, including car theft, assault, and breaking and entering. His relationships with women were turbulent. He married once briefly and fathered a child, but his inability to maintain stability led to estrangement. He became increasingly isolated and resentful, harboring anger at authority and at the social structures that he felt had failed him. By 1965, Speck had developed a pattern of moving from city to city, often staying in cheap hotels or boarding houses, committing small thefts, and drinking heavily. In July 1966, he arrived in Chicago, Illinois, where he found work as a laborer and occasionally at local bars. During this period, he became acquainted with women working in nursing and other service professions, learning their routines and locations. Speck's fascination with power and control over others grew, and his fantasies of domination began to focus on women in vulnerable positions. On the night of July 13, 1966, Richard Speck entered a small student nurse's residence in South Chicago. 8 student nurses were living there at the time. Speck had observed the residence, learning the habits of the women and when they would be home. That night, he gained entry by overpowering a young man who lived in the building. Once inside, Speck systematically terrorized the residents. He bound, beat, and murdered 7 of the 8 women in a horrific spree that lasted several hours. The brutality of the murders was extreme, yet Speck displayed a disturbing level of calm and methodical behavior. He moved from room to room, selecting victims, tying them up, and using a knife to carry out his attacks. One young woman survived by hiding under a bed and remained undiscovered until Speck left the premises. Her testimony would later become crucial in reconstructing the events of that night. When authorities arrived the next morning, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. 7 young women had been murdered, and the 8th survivor provided the first detailed account of the assailant. The crime shocked the nation. Chicago, already wary of violent crime in its neighborhoods, was gripped by terror. Residents locked doors, women avoided being alone at night, and the media broadcast the gruesome details widely. The manhunt for Speck was immediate. Chicago police, state authorities, and the FBI coordinated to apprehend him. Investigators discovered that Speck had left behind evidence in the form of fingerprints, personal items, and a distinct pattern of movement through the city. Witnesses described seeing a man matching his appearance fleeing the area. Speck attempted to hide in cheap motels and with acquaintances, but the public was on alert and police intensified patrols. Speck's capture came 10 days later when he was recognized by a taxi driver who had picked him up in a hotel lobby. Authorities arrested him without incident. Once in custody, Speck was cooperative in identifying locations he had visited and provided limited information about the murders, but he expressed little remorse. Psychological evaluations conducted during his detention revealed a pattern of antisocial behavior, narcissism, and extreme impulsivity. Experts concluded that he was driven by deep-seated anger toward women, combined with a sense of entitlement and a fascination with domination. The trial of Richard Speck began in April 1967. The courtroom was packed, the public intensely interested in a case that had shocked the nation. Evidence included survivor testimony, forensic analysis, and witness accounts. Speck's demeanor in court was unsettling. He displayed a calm, almost detached presence while the prosecution presented graphic details of the murders. His defense attempted to claim mental instability, but expert testimony and the premeditated nature of the crimes undermined these claims. After deliberation, the jury found Speck guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. Over the years, Speck's sentence was reduced to life imprisonment after changes in death penalty law and appeals. He spent decades in Illinois correctional facilities, where he became notorious among fellow inmates and staff for erratic behavior. Despite efforts at rehabilitation, he remained largely unrepentant. Speck's life ended in prison on December 5, 1991, from natural causes. The murders of the South Chicago student nurses left a lasting scar on the community and reshaped public awareness of personal safety and the vulnerability of women living alone. Speck's methodical cruelty and ability to evade capture for days created a profound fear, and his case remains a subject of study for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals seeking to understand the mind of a predator who operated in plain sight. Next story. Aileen Carol Wernos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her early life was marked by trauma, neglect, and instability. Her mother, Diane, was a teenager at the time of Eileen's birth and had a history of alcoholism. Eileen's biological father was largely absent, and she was raised in a household fraught with poverty and abuse. At the age of 4, her parents' relationship ended, and Eileen's mother soon abandoned her, leaving her to be raised by her grandparents. Her grandfather was reportedly abusive, physically punishing her and her brother for minor misbehaviors. By the time she was 8, Aileen had experienced profound emotional and physical neglect, shaping a deep mistrust of adults and authority. By her early teens, Aileen began showing troubling behavior. She was often truant from school and had difficulty forming stable friendships. She ran away from home several times and entered a cycle of petty theft, substance abuse, and sexual activity with older men. At 13, she became pregnant, though the child was later stillborn. The combination of trauma, early sexualization, and exposure to violence created a foundation for the behavior that would later define her criminal life. After leaving Michigan, Aileen drifted through several states, living on the margins of society. By the late 1970s, she had arrived in Florida, where she became a sex worker to support herself. During this time, she met several men who would further influence her developing perception of the world as a dangerous and hostile place. She suffered assaults and betrayals that reinforced her sense of anger and desperation. Eileen's violent crimes began in earnest in 1989. Over the course of roughly a year, she murdered 7 men in Florida, claiming self-defense in each case. Her victims were mostly middle-aged men she met while working as a sex worker. In each encounter, Aileen alleged that the men attempted to assault or exploit her, and she responded with lethal force. She used a .22 caliber pistol to carry out the killings, shooting her victims in the head or chest. The crimes were committed in various locations, including parking lots, rural roads, and hotel rooms, reflecting both her mobility and the chaotic nature of her life. The first known murder occurred in November 1989, when Aileen killed Richard Mallory, a man she had met while working the streets of Daytona Beach. She shot him at close range and left his body near a wooded area. Over the next year, she killed 6 more men under similar circumstances, often driving to remote locations to commit the acts. Each murder was followed by theft of the victim's wallet or car, both to sustain herself and as a form of escape. Law enforcement initially struggled to link the murders. The victims came from different areas, and the crimes were spread across multiple counties. Investigators eventually identified a pattern through ballistic analysis and witness statements. Surveillance and tips from citizens eventually led authorities to focus on Aileen as a suspect. She was arrested on January 9, 1991, after a relative provided information that implicated her in the murders. During interrogation, Aileen was strikingly candid. She admitted to killing the men, but insisted that she acted in self-defense, fearing for her life each time she drew her gun. Psychological evaluations later diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder and antisocial tendencies, but her attorneys argued that her unstable upbringing and trauma played a major role in her actions. The case quickly drew national attention, with the media portraying her both as a cold-blooded killer and a victim of circumstance. The trial for the first murder began in 1992. Aileen was convicted of killing Richard Mallory and sentenced to death. Subsequent trials resulted in additional death sentences for the other murders. Despite her notoriety, she remained a figure of public fascination, with debates surrounding her mental health, the influence of abuse, and the morality of her actions. Aileen Wuornos spent her final years on death row in Florida. She became the subject of documentaries, books, and films, all exploring her life, crimes, and psychology. On October 9, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. Her life and crimes left a lasting impression on American society, highlighting the intersections of trauma, gender, and violence, and sparking ongoing discussion about the circumstances that can produce such extreme criminal behavior. Next story. David Richard Berkowitz was born on June 1, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His early life was fraught with confusion and emotional instability. He was adopted shortly after birth by the Berkowitz family, who had been unable to conceive a child of their own. Although they provided material stability, David felt alienated and rejected, struggling with feelings of abandonment and inadequacy. His adoptive mother was overprotective and controlling, while his father was distant and authoritarian. These dynamics fostered in David a profound sense of anger and isolation, which would later manifest in violent behavior. As a teenager, David began exhibiting troubling behaviors. He became fascinated with weapons, particularly firearms, and developed an interest in vigilante justice and the occult. He experimented with drugs, often marijuana, and engaged in petty theft and other minor criminal activities. He struggled to form stable social connections, often retreating into fantasies where he wielded power over others. His fascination with religion and the supernatural intensified, and he became convinced that he was part of a larger cosmic struggle between good and evil. In the early 1970s, David married a young woman named Elizabeth, but the marriage was unstable. He found employment sporadically, often quitting jobs abruptly or being dismissed for misconduct. During this period, he began to experience auditory hallucinations, claiming that he was receiving messages from a demon-possessed dog who commanded him to kill. He became obsessed with these messages, believing that he had been chosen to punish people for their sins. On the night of July 29, 1976, David Berkowitz began a series of shootings that would terrorize New York City for over a year. He targeted young couples sitting in parked cars, shooting at them from the sidewalk with a .44 caliber revolver. The first known victim, Donna Loria, and her boyfriend were seriously wounded, but escaped with minor injuries. Over the following months, Berkowitz escalated his attacks, killing several victims and injuring others. His method was simple but terrifying. Approach couples in secluded areas at night, open fire, and flee without leaving an obvious trace. The city was gripped by fear. New York newspapers ran daily updates, and the police were under immense pressure to apprehend the shooter. Residents avoided going out at night. Parents warned teenagers about dating in secluded areas, and many people carried weapons for protection. The randomness of the attacks and the apparent invisibility of the killer created a climate of paranoia, with the public unsure when or where the next attack might occur. Berkowitz became increasingly bold, leaving letters for the police and newspapers that taunted investigators. In one such letter, he signed himself the Son of Sam, the name that would become infamous nationwide. These letters revealed his obsession with notoriety and his desire to control public perception of his crimes. The letters were filled with references to demonic possession, religious punishment, and personal justifications for his actions. Investigators eventually traced the shootings through a combination of witness reports, ballistic evidence, and careful analysis of Berkowitz's movements. On August 10, 1977, the investigation culminated in his capture. A uniformed police officer noticed Berkowitz's suspicious behavior while he was parking a car, and after questioning, Berkowitz confessed to the shootings. He provided details of his crimes, the locations of each attack, and explained his belief that he had been commanded by supernatural forces. David Berkowitz was tried in 1978 and pleaded guilty to 6 murders and several attempted murders. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In prison, he became a born-again Christian, expressing remorse for his actions and participating in religious study groups. Despite his confessions and rehabilitation efforts, the Son of Sam case left a permanent imprint on New York City, reshaping public consciousness about safety, the unpredictability of violent crime, and the media's role in creating fear and fascination around serial killers. The case also prompted changes in law enforcement tactics, particularly in response to public threats that spanned multiple jurisdictions. Berkowitz's combination of random attacks, media interaction, and psychological complexity made him one of the most studied criminals of the late 20th century. His life story, crimes, and eventual repentance remain a cautionary tale about the intersection of mental illness, obsession, and societal neglect. Next story. Edward Theodore Gain was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the second of two children in a family shaped by strict religious beliefs and isolation. His father, George Gain, was a harsh, domineering man who struggled with alcohol and frequently criticized his children. His mother, Augusta, was intensely religious, fanatical in her beliefs, and instilled in Ed a deep fear of women, sex, and sin. She preached that all women, aside from herself, were inherently corrupt and destined for damnation. Augusta's obsessive control created an environment in which Ed grew up terrified, obedient, and socially withdrawn. From an early age, Ed was described as quiet, lonely, and withdrawn. He had minimal contact with other children, attending school only sporadically, and was frequently bullied for his strange behavior. He became fascinated with death and graveyards, often visiting the local cemetery alone. His mother's extreme teachings about sin and punishment instilled in him both guilt and fear, particularly around sexuality. After his father's death in 1940 and the death of his brother shortly thereafter, Ed was left alone with his mother. Her influence intensified as he became her primary companion. He obeyed her every demand and developed an unhealthy attachment, never forming friendships outside the home. After Augusta Gain died in 1945, Ed was left isolated and unprepared to navigate normal social life. He became increasingly withdrawn, spending time scavenging in graveyards at night. His fascination with human remains grew into an obsession. He would dig up recently buried corpses, removing body parts and bringing them home. Over time, he began to commit murders to acquire human flesh directly, eliminating the uncertainty of grave robbing. Ed Gain's first confirmed murder occurred in 1954 when he killed Mary Hogan, a local barmaid. He strangled her and later mutilated her body, keeping parts of it in his home. Over the next several years, he continued similar acts, often targeting elderly women resembling his mother in appearance. He would murder, dismember, and preserve their body parts, using them for personal rituals, clothing, or household items. His crimes remained undiscovered for years due to the rural isolation of his property and the infrequency of his public interactions. The horror of Gain's activities came to light in 1957 after the disappearance of Bernice Wardens, a local hardware store owner. Police traced her last known movements to Gain's property and discovered a series of grotesque and shocking items. In his home, investigators found human skulls, bones fashioned into household furniture, and preserved skin used to create masks, clothing, and decorations. The entire property was a scene of macabre obsession, reflecting both his meticulous planning and his psychological disturbance. He admitted to grave robbing and to the murders, but claimed he was compelled by his desire to create women's suits from the skin of the deceased. Ed Gain's arrest and trial captivated the nation. Psychologists evaluated him and determined that he suffered from severe mental illness, including schizotypal personality disorder and necrophilic tendencies. He was found legally insane and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution rather than prison. Gain's case became one of the most infamous examples of how isolation, abuse, and psychological disturbance could culminate in extreme criminal behavior. During his time in institutions, Gain remained a figure of public fascination. His story influenced numerous books, films, and fictional characters, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Despite the sensationalism, experts emphasize that Gain's crimes were the product of an extraordinarily abnormal life, shaped by rigid religious indoctrination, childhood trauma, and profound isolation. Edward Gain died on July 26, 1984, in a mental institution in Madison, Wisconsin. His legacy remains as a cautionary tale of how untreated psychological trauma, severe social isolation, and obsession can escalate into acts of extreme violence. The Gain case also influenced forensic psychology and criminal profiling, highlighting the ways that abnormal behavior can escalate to homicide and macabre rituals when left unchecked. The quiet, rural life he led masked the depth of his pathology until his actions were uncovered, leaving a permanent mark on both American criminal history and popular culture. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of three sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of a killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly, even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, but the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse, explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of 3 children, with 2 sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created 2 characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth-seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jay McDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear, and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, it has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child, he wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, the murder seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult, as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens, and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970. And after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and 2 of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Weggerl, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicki Weggerl's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police, all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Next story. The story of Eileen Wuornos begins not in the chaos of her crimes, but in the turbulence of her early childhood. She was born in February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a teenage mother and a father who would never play a role in her life. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended up in prison, later taking his own life, and her mother abandoned Eileen and her brother when Eileen was only a toddler. The 2 children were left to the care of their grandparents. a home that was supposed to provide safety, but instead became another environment of instability and abuse. Eileen's grandfather was a violent man, and her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. From an early age, Aileen experienced neglect, violence, and exploitation. By the time she was 11 years old, she had already begun trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money, surviving in a world that offered her no protection. She became pregnant as a teenager after being assaulted, and her baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, she was expelled from her home, left to survive entirely on her own. Her teenage years unfolded on the margins of society. She hitchhiked across states, lived outdoors, and engaged in sex work to sustain herself. Eileen's life became a cycle of transient relationships, brushes with the law, and survival through whatever means she could find. She was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and disorderly conduct. The years hardened her, stripping away any sense of stability or belonging. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was living in Florida, still drifting and surviving as a sex worker along highways. It was there, beginning in 1989, that her violent crimes began. Unlike many serial killers who targeted specific groups for twisted psychological reasons, Wuornos' murders were bound up with her own life circumstances. She claimed she killed men who had picked her up for sex when they became violent or attempted to assault her. But prosecutors would later argue her crimes were calculated robberies, carried out under the guise of self-defense. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who picked her up along a Florida highway. In December 1989, his body was discovered abandoned in his car, shot multiple times. At first, the murder seemed like an isolated case, but over the next year, more bodies appeared. The victims were all men, found along roadsides or in wooded areas, killed with a gun, and often robbed of their belongings or vehicles. As the body count rose, eventually reaching 7 confirmed murders, fear spread through Central Florida. Police connected the killings by the consistent method and by witness descriptions of a woman seen with some of the victims shortly before their deaths. A key detail helped narrow the search. Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore, had crashed one of the victims' cars and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints. Those prints were traced back to Wuornos, already known to law enforcement for her long history of arrests. Investigators began a manhunt, but Wuornos was elusive, moving from cheap motels to bars, living in constant motion. In January 1991, police finally caught her at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. She was arrested without incident, though she maintained a tough and defiant demeanor. Her partner, Tyria Moore, became a crucial figure in the case. Pressured by investigators, Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. She called Wuornos while under police surveillance, persuading her to confess to the killings. On tape, Wuornos admitted to several murders, repeating her claim that she acted in self-defense against violent clients. Her trial became a national spectacle. In 1992, she was tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, though evidence from other killings was also introduced. The jury heard not only about the crimes, but also about her troubled past, her years of abandonment and abuse. Yet prosecutors argued that her pattern of taking money, possessions, and cars from her victims showed her true motive. After only a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Wuornos faced additional trials for the other murders, each ending in further convictions and death sentences. She became one of the rare women on death row in the United States. Her demeanor in court was unpredictable. At times, she appeared calm and resigned. At other times, she lashed out, shouting at the judge, jury, or prosecutors, declaring her hatred for society and her belief that everyone was against her. Wuornos' story drew wide attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the complicated questions they raised. Some saw her as a victim of abuse and exploitation, a woman who had been failed by every institution meant to protect her, whose violence was an extension of the violence inflicted upon her. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on men and used her history as an excuse. Her life and crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and eventually the film Monster, which dramatized her story. But behind the media portrayal was a woman who lived nearly her entire life in pain, anger, and alienation. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final moments, she gave a rambling statement referencing outer space, Armageddon, and her belief that she would return. She died quickly, ending a life that had been marked from childhood by violence and instability. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos remains controversial. To some, she symbolizes how cycles of abuse and neglect can create a person capable of great harm. To others, she is remembered simply as a killer who took innocent lives. What is undeniable is that her story stands apart in the history of American crime. A rare example of a female serial killer whose crimes gripped the nation and left behind endless debate about justice, responsibility, and the roots of violence. Her life reminds us how deeply environment and trauma can shape a person, but also how society struggles to reconcile sympathy with accountability. For her victims and their families, the question of motive mattered little compared to the irreversible loss they suffered. For true crime history, the name Aileen Wuornos remains forever etched as both a cautionary tale and a chilling story of violence born from a life of suffering. Next story. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins in the suburbs of Chicago, where he was born in March 1942 to a working-class family. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, life was harsh and unforgiving. His father was an alcoholic with a violent temper who regularly belittled and beat him. His mother, though more nurturing, could not shield him from the constant abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, especially from his father, yet he rarely received anything but criticism. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his physical activity. He often felt like an outsider, excluded from sports, and overshadowed by his father's disdain. But beneath his fragile health and troubled home life, Gacy began developing the traits that would later define him: charm, manipulation, and a hunger for recognition. By his teenage years, Gacy began finding ways to fit in socially. He was known as friendly and eager to help, often volunteering for school and community projects. But his personal life already carried shadows. He struggled with his sexuality, something he kept hidden at a time when homosexuality was harshly judged. His need to maintain a public image while concealing his private desires would become a recurring theme throughout his life. In early adulthood, Gacy drifted into sales and business management, where his charisma proved useful. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and capable of winning people over. But cracks appeared quickly. In the 1960s, after marrying and moving to Iowa, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison, where he earned a reputation as a model inmate, and was released after serving only a portion of his sentence. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking their children and leaving him to start over. When Gacy returned to Illinois, he reinvented himself. He became a contractor, starting his own business and employing local young men. He became active in Democratic Party politics, even posing for photographs with prominent politicians. He volunteered in the community, organizing parties and entertaining children while dressed as Pogo the Clown, a character he created. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed generous and dependable, a man who gave back to his community. But behind this mask, Gacy was living a double life of unimaginable horror. From 1972 to 1978, he lured dozens of young men and teenage boys to his home. Some were employees, others were hitchhikers or runaways, and some simply disappeared after meeting him. Once inside, Gacy used various ruses to trap his victims, including a so-called magic trick where he handcuffed them under the pretense of showing them an escape trick. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and murder. The scale of his crimes would not be fully understood until years later. Gacy disposed of many of his victims by burying them in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. When that space became overcrowded, he began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, his murders went unnoticed, hidden by his outward image of respectability and civic involvement. Suspicion began to mount in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen leaving work to meet Gacy about a potential job. When police investigated, they quickly connected Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A background check revealed his prior conviction for sexual assault, raising alarm. Detectives began surveillance on Gacy, following him around the clock. As they built their case, they gathered witness statements and evidence linking him to other missing young men. The pressure mounted, and Gacy, increasingly paranoid, began drinking heavily and confiding strange things to friends. In December 1978, police executed a search warrant at Gacy's home. What they found was overwhelming. Beneath the house, investigators uncovered a gruesome burial ground. One body after another was exhumed, eventually totaling 29 victims buried on his property, with additional bodies recovered from the nearby river. The revelations shocked the nation. Gacy, the man who had dressed as a clown for children's parties and mingled with politicians, was now revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The contrast between his public persona and his hidden crimes made the case unforgettable. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial began in 1980 and quickly became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions Gacy had made during interrogation and the remains of victims discovered in his crawl space. The defense attempted to argue that Gacy was insane, claiming he had multiple personalities and that one of them, not the man himself, had committed the murders. The jury was not convinced. After a short deliberation, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the highest confirmed victim counts for a single killer in the United States. He was sentenced to death. For more than a decade, Gacy remained on death row, filing appeals and granting interviews. In these interviews, he alternated between admitting guilt, denying involvement, and even blaming others. He painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of lies, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, and his final words were defiant, a reflection of the arrogance that had marked much of his life. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror and betrayal. He was a man who hid his darkest crimes behind the painted smile of a clown, deceiving his community while committing acts of unspeakable violence. His case forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, that a man who entertains children can also be capable of burying their peers beneath his own home. The Gacy murders remain a landmark case in American criminal history, a chilling reminder of how deception and cruelty can coexist within one person. For the families of his victims, the story is not about the bizarre details of his double life, but about the young lives cut short and the years of pain that followed. Even today, the name John Wayne Gacy evokes both fear and fascination, a symbol of hidden darkness and the limits of trust. His crawl space became a graveyard, his home a house of horrors, and his name one of the most infamous in the history of crime. Next